Hey, how you guys doing? My name is Michael McCormick, and I am a private forensic investigator. I live and grew up in Baltimore City. I spent several years on the Marine Corps, and what makes this investigation I'm working on, which is the Freddie Gray investigation here in Baltimore, most of you around the country, if you don't know or been in the box, Freddie Gray was arrested on April 12th of 2015, and he died a week later based on the injuries he allegedly received while being transported in the Baltimore police van to the jail. There's been a number of controversies surrounding whether or not Mr. Gray was injured prior to getting in the van, as well as receiving a rough ride from the driver of the van from the Baltimore Police Department. Just to give you a little background on me, again, investigative-wise, I spent 10 years on the Baltimore City Police Department as a police officer and a drug enforcement officer in the Central District and the Western District. I spent 2 or 3 years as a field training officer for young officers who come out of the academy. I had made numerous arrests, gone to college, got an advanced degree in criminal justice from Coppin State University, undergrad work from University of Maryland Eastern Shore. But what I bring to the table in terms of this investigation is I bring an insight based upon, number one, how police think, work, and act in the real world policing, and I bring my own investigative intuitiveness to the table as well. Matter of fact, I might be one of the first ones that when this incident first broke a couple years back, I was one of the first ones that said to myself, and I voiced it to friends of mine and some colleagues, that Freddie Gray, if he died, the reason surrounding his death, in my estimation, would have come from his initial arrest and takedown. And that was based solely on what I already knew, kind of like nationally, when people get hurt that are placed under arrest by police. If they're going to get hurt, it's been probably, I would say, overwhelmingly 85% of the time, they're going to get hurt during the actual arrest. That can come from resisting arrest, that can come from officers on the offensive, doing a takedown. Officers generally can take down people several different ways depending on how they're trained and what they were taught in the academy. If we've noticed over the years, some of the high-profile cases with Eric Garner dealing with the, I can't breathe and a choke takedown. A couple other takedowns that we've seen captured on video recently. Some of those takedowns are questionable because different jurisdictions teach different things in terms of officer takedown in the field. But one of the things that kept me wondering about this case is that there aren't a lot of cases on a national scale, and I bring this to bear to challenge any jurisdiction out there. There's over 18,000 police departments within the United States, and I have yet to see any numbers where you could show me that people actually have died in the numbers relative to the numbers of particular officer takedowns during the arrest, as opposed to those who have died in the transport of a van. I would argue, and I have argued, that those particular arrests, those particular transportations in vans, I couldn't count on my hand within this city police department. I think there were 2 incidents in all the years that they've been using these particular new vans where individuals were hurt in a van. Nobody died that I know of. And if they did die, it was maybe perhaps 2 or 3 years down the road. I don't know. I just don't have those stats. But those stats are surely insignificant compared to the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of arrests that are made nationwide across this country, where officers doing foot pursuit, vehicle pursuits, whether it's in daytime or nighttime, or captured on helicopters above, where those arrests aren't physical in terms of takedowns. Most of them that we see on TV are pretty much violent in terms of takedowns, is what we're seeing. And that's in the real world too. There are a lot of violent takedowns, depending on the officers involved in the case, depending on whether or not a suspect is resisting or not resisting, and there's always controversy over that, because we see a lot of stuff nowadays on TV where and on video where where individuals are seem to be complying in many cases. And in those cases, what we're seeing is that there's ongoing force, unnecessary, as they say in the field, unnecessary in legal term, unnecessary force being used to restrain suspects, unnecessary force being used to take down suspects, particularly people who are in compliance. Compliance means compliance. I mean, I don't think that's a word that needs to be thrown around or battered around amongst the law enforcement community or the legal community. It's just what it is. A person gives up, and officers know when a person gives up. To say that you don't know is someone who's really not well trained, that doesn't know what they're talking about in the field. And so you have these incidences where some of these takedowns get kind of rough and they go over the top. In this case here with Freddie Gray, based upon my investigation along with some of my assistants out in the field, we've come away with a different take on this whole incident. We've collected still shots of the area where Freddie Gray was arrested. We've talked to several people in the area. I've talked to a couple of other noted criminal justice professionals in the field these professionals have been interviewed on CNN and as well as local TV stations as well. And they all have said the same thing, that they had suspected that Freddie Gray was injured somehow during the arrest. And the two people that all police reports point to, all reports in terms of the court, and it was filed with the court, all internal affairs reports, the statements are coming from two officers, and the only two officers that were part of the arrest team, and that would be Officer Edward Nero, who was a bike officer that morning, and Officer Garrett Miller. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And Officer Garrett Miller was also, he's Lieutenant Miller, he was also there on patrol. But Officer Garrett Miller, I'm sorry, Officer Garrett Miller. So, and again, I'm doing this particular video in my office, and I'm not scripting it, so it's just coming off the top of my head. So I'm flowing with what I have now. So it's not scripted. So if I kind of jump back and forth, that's the reason why. So what we came away with was this. We went back. I think the most important thing was to go back and look at what statements were made to Internal Affairs. And I'm going to read a statement starting with Officer Miller, who says that, excuse me a second. Here we go. Oh, let me get back. Okay, sorry about that. Officer Miller, who says that this is an investigation, this is Internal Affairs interview. Officer Miller doesn't say why Gray was chased, but says Gray put his hands up. And his words now, gave up without a fight. I handcuffed him, my handcuffs, pulled him over to, or stood him up, I should say, and took him over to where my bike was. I was afraid somebody would steal my bike because that happens. When we had him there, he said he was having trouble breathing, so we set him up. Officer Miller goes on to say, as a crowd formed, or audience, as Miller calls it, Gray began flailing, kicking, and screaming. Behavior that got worse. He said, when Gray was loaded into the police van head first. It was later that Officer Miller got the call that Gray was injured. The detectives asked me, said, well, at any point in the incident, was anyone insistently forceful with the suspect? Did you see anybody kick, punch, slap, or strike with any objects? And Officer Miller's reply was, no, sir. And this is taken shortly after the arrest on that day with his interview from the Baltimore Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. Well, having gone out to the scene, having looked at the medical examiner's report, we did look at that. We looked at that 100 different ways. And one of the things that came about in this particular case, and one of the main reasons why I went back, is because the Baltimore Police Department released 2 films that day that were exhibits in the trial. And those exhibits were 2 videos that were shot. Both of those video cameras are on Presbury Street. Exhibit 41. Exhibit, let's see. Exhibit 41 and Exhibit 56 were the video camera that day, and where the video camera was actually shot and submitted to the court for evidence in this particular case. Those video cameras would not have been able, based on their positioning, would not have been able to see inside the courtyard area where the takedown took place. It's important to remember that those 2 videos were the only videos submitted to the court where the takedown did not take place. So, what we do see on both of those videos, based on the timestamps, would be Officer Nero on his bike in the area, pretty much some 60-some feet away from the courtyard where the takedown took place. And we see some passerbys. Remember, this is 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Virtually a handful of people are up in that area that time of morning. Trust me, I worked the area for many years. I know the patterns of a lot of folk who live in that area. And there were not a lot of people on a Sunday morning up that morning. That's why initially, and still today, you didn't have a lot of witnesses to this case. Had this case happened on the 4 to 12 shift between, let's say, 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 9 o'clock at night, we probably would have had hundreds of people to witness this particular case. And the outcome probably would have been a lot different in terms of what we have found out and what we now know today to be and truly believe, based only on this is no speculation. This is based on the evidence that we've uncovered, that in fact Officer Miller is responsible for the takedown as well as the damage done to Mr. Gray. Now, in this particular trial that went before Judge Williams, I believe, Judge Williams, Officer Miller says, many occasions, that Officer Nero had nothing to do with this takedown. He was on his bike in the street area. I was the one who did it. I was the one who handcuffed him. This is what he said. So he's absolving Officer Nero of any contact at all with Mr. Gray. Now, my police sense tells me, based upon the years I've spent in the police department, based upon the situations I've seen officers get themselves caught up in, where it's kind of a officer starting to look out for his brother, where one officer says, okay, I know you saw me do this, but if we ever have to go to court, I'm going to say you didn't see anything. This way you don't get involved, and if I get in trouble, it'll just be me. So, and this goes back to why I look back at the internal affairs statement, because the internal affairs statement says, without a doubt, and this is Officer Miller's own testimony, that okay, excuse me, this is in the court, his courtroom testimony. At 8:40:13, there's a call over the police radio where either Miller or the defendant calls out, "We got one." Miller testified that he apprehended Mr. Gray and that Mr. Gray gave up without a fight and did not resist. Always remind yourselves of what I'm saying, because I'm going to come back to this. He says that Miller testified that he apprehended Mr. Gray and that Mr. Gray gave up without a fight and did not resist. He also testified that the defendant, talking about in this case here, Officer Nero, who's the defendant on trial, did not touch Gray at any time prior to the time Miller approached or detained Gray. By the time Miller cuffed Gray, the defendant, talking about Nero, was standing to the left at a ramp. While Miller believed that the defendant, Nero, was ready to assist because they worked together, he reiterated that the defendant did not have anything to do with cuffing and initial detention. So that initial detention means there was some type of takedown, physical arrest made, and a subsequent handcuff. That's what Miller is saying. He's also, again, absolving Officer Nero. The only problem with this is that he puts Officer Nero on the scene, which is huge, because in this case here, Officer Nero technically was a witness and yet was never treated as a witness against Officer Miller in this particular case. Now, it gets back to what I just said before, how my police sense comes out and says, okay, both of us are in this, but I don't want you in this as deep as I'm going to be in it. And this statement would have never been made had Freddie Gray not died. Again, this is a court statement, so this is way after Freddie Gray's death. They're in court now. And so this statement that, well, he didn't have anything to do with the initial cuffing and detention. Well, it's one thing to say that, but he certainly had something to do with his observation that day and that morning. And because Officer Nero was never treated as a defendant in this case, in terms of he was never treated as a witness in this case, we'll never know what his testimony would have been, because we have not gotten anything from the police department to say what his testimony would have been. But when you do forensic investigation and you go back and you start talking to people and you start looking at the area and just spending some time, a few days at a time, and just looking at different things, you get the feeling that things aren't all what they said they were. Now, had it not been for a third camera view, and this is the first time that you all will probably hear about this, because it was never reported until the last, say, way after when the trials were over with. The Sun paper gets a third video that was actually recorded in the courtyard where the takedown had taken place. Unbeknownst to the police department, who actually submitted the video to the Sun papers, this motion detector video was able to capture not only what was going on with Freddie Gray and Officer Miller in one part of the video, but it also captured co-defendant, Mr. Devontae Rory. Devontae Rory, if you're not from this area, folks out there, if you didn't pay attention to the Freddie Gray case, you would have never known that there was another suspect that was seen with Freddie Gray who ran from the police that morning. And his name was Devontae Rory. Officer Miller will have you to believe, his testimony, he will have you to believe that he did not know either Gray or Rory. The fact of the matter is that a few months earlier, he in fact did arrest Devontae Rory for a possession of narcotics. And he was also scheduled to go to trial with Devontae Rory like a month or two after Freddie Gray's death. So when when a police officer gets on the stand, or when a police officer has to go through whatever trial board situation, or when he's going to be questioned about something, he has a tendency, some officers have a tendency to leave out facts. And this is a huge fact, because even though the court ruled in their favor that under two cases, United States cases, one called Wardlow and the other one called the Terry, which is the Terry stop and frisk case, that he said Miller did have a right to stop Mr. Gray. Okay? But Officer Miller never articulated that he even knew Devontae Rory. We don't find this out until, like I say, a few months afterwards, that in fact he did in fact know Devontae Rory, and there was eye contact made, and that eye contact came from Devontae Rory. Devontae Rory knows who Officer Miller is because he's the one who arrested him, so he knew. But in this particular video, I'm gonna get back to this video. This video is what you call prima facie evidence that there was activity in that courtyard, based upon all the timestamps from the two videos that I told you that were on Pressman Street, and this third video that was never was this video submitted to the court in Baltimore City for review by Judge Williams whatsoever. Never was this video enhanced by the state's attorney's office, by the FBI, by no one, not even the Baltimore City Police Department. Never enhanced this video. The reason the video was turned over, I believe, was that it showed Devontae Rory in the lower quarter section of this particular video entering the Bruce courtyard, approximately 80 yards south of where Freddie Gray's apprehension was taking place. Also where Freddie Gray, which we believe through looking at the still shots through the video, where Officer Miller was actually stomping Freddie Gray pretty much to death. Part of the still shots you will see where Officer Miller is standing over Gray, and Gray's arms up in the air. He's not handcuffed, and according to Miller's testimony that he was handcuffed. Well, you can't move your arms if you're handcuffed. And the still shots in this case, as we play the motion video, will show that Freddie Gray was never handcuffed, as Officer Miller told Internal Affairs and as well as the court. Okay, so both of those are fabrications. But I'm gonna hold on just a second because I'm gonna get back to this video. I can tell you, this is not scripted, so I'm jumping back and forth. But there's a flow here, and there's a train of thought that I want you guys to follow. Now, once Freddie Gray had died, and once the officers had pretty much told authorities where the arrest took place, once Freddie Gray had died, there were two scenes that should have been treated as homicide scenes. The first should have been, and I think everybody knows by now, having seen the video initially, where Freddie Gray is laying on the ground and he's screaming and hollering, and the officers have him on the ground where everybody can kind of see. And then you have the video being taken of him limping, or his leg going limp and being dragged to the police van. That's pretty much the national video that was out there and has been out there for months, you know, and since 2015. That's the video that we all kind of know. It brought us to attention of you know, what was going on with Freddie Gray. But the reason I mention that is because when Freddie Gray, Now, well, the reason I mention that is because that is one of the videos that was also submitted into evidence, and this was shot by a young man who lived in the area, who subsequently was a witness in this case as well, because he never saw the initial takedown. All he filmed was the second location, which I call the second location, which is the last location where Freddie Gray was taken to, which was the one shot naturally. Okay. The reason I say that is because that becomes, once Freddie Gray expired, he dies in hospital, that location now becomes a homicide scene. That is a homicide scene. That is a scene that needs to be investigated by homicide. It is a scene that needs to be gone over through the crime lab. That whole little area right there where he's arrested. The takedown area where Officer Miller testified, where he apprehended Freddie Gray, is also a homicide scene. But when you have the state's attorney's office, who's already conferred with the medical examiner in this case, and the decision has been made to make this a case of homicide by a rough ride in a van, the only thing that becomes a homicide scene is the van itself. In this case here, the van itself was treated as a homicide scene. The van was gone over by detectives. It was gone over by the medical examiner's office who came to look at the van. And it was gone over by the crime lab as well. However, the two scenes that I mentioned first, the takedown and the subsequent taking to the second location, were never treated as homicide scenes. The officers were never treated as suspects at any point. These two officers were never treated as suspects at that point. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that the state's attorney's office, after completing their investigation, indicated that there would be 6 indictments. Officer Miller and Officer Nero, who have been the topic of my discussion since I started this video here, had the least charges. Out of all the 6 defendants, had the least charges. And so they never become actual suspects in terms of murder, because they were never charged with murder. The only person that was charged with murder, if you will, or one of the counts leading up to a murder charge, was a transportation officer, Goodson. Now, let me interject some police thought in here just for a second again. I drove the van, or back in the day when I was working, it was called a paddy wagon. And the rules were, as a van officer or paddy wagon driver, that number 1, if the prisoner in detention asked for medical help, you told the arresting officer, your prisoner is asking for medical help, I'm taking him straight to the hospital. You need to meet me there because I have to put my van back in service, or my vehicle back in service to, assist other officers in the field, the transportation. Okay, it was a known general order, in fact, that that's what you do. That's what you do. Once you see a suspect who's been either roughed up or is hurt on his own, you immediately take him to the emergency room, no questions asked. Do not go, collect $200 go and pass go. You go straight to the hospital. Okay. Well, I had to ask myself, Officer Goodson had 16 years on the police department. 16 years. What person in their right mind is going to throw away 16 years of a police officer's career? Mind you, he had 16 years, more than any of the 6 officers arrested. He had 16 years. What is going to make this officer lie for other officers who have injured a suspect? Why would this officer lie and jeopardize his job? Well, for one, Freddie Gray's injuries at that particular time were internal injuries. He had a few scrapes and bruises. That's typical. Maybe they warranted some attention through the medical personnel. Maybe they didn't. However, once it was determined by Officer Goodson, after he conferred with his supervisors on location in the field, that Freddie Gray needed to be transferred to hospital, then sure, he was taken at that point. But my main concern was that and hear me out on this, because this is important. Why would an officer on a Sunday morning, excuse me, on a Sunday morning, Freddie Gray, all people who this officer don't even know, Goodson, the driver, they ain't never had a run-in at all. There's no animosity between either one of those guys. Why would Officer Goodson give a person with 16 years on the department, don't even know the guy in the van, a rough ride? What's the motivation? What is the motivation? There is none. There is none. Was it dereliction of duty? Of course, at some point it does, because the man died. But what would have been his motivation? Because in all homicides, we always look for what? A motive. Okay, so what was this guy's motive to actually do this individual harm? Well, it is my belief, it is my colleagues' belief, it is other professionals' belief that in fact Officer Goodson didn't give this man a rough ride. Remember earlier I talked about the nationwide stats on rough rides and death? They're virtually non-existent. In fact, it never came up in the trial about how many rough rides nationally the people that police officers give people when they end up dying. It was never something that was never even sought by the prosecution's office, which would have been nice if that's the theory that they were going on. It would have been nice to glean some statistics from other departments to find out whether or not, you know, there are people dying in van rides. Well, they didn't do it. And you didn't do it because the numbers weren't there. So when I look at a motive in this case for an officer with 16 years on, never been an officer who's, look at his jacket, he was an officer that really just didn't get in trouble at all. For him to just all of a sudden, like the clear blue sky one Sunday morning, say, you know what, let me give this guy a rough ride. Just didn't make sense. So I want to take us back to the third video, back in Bruce Court. This video, was our determination that this video appeared to be tampered with in terms of its timestamps, in terms of what action was going on. Now remember, this is a motion-centered video, this third video, Bruce Court. As soon as you see this video is actually showing action that's going up in the, they call the background of the video, the top left corner. That's because there's motion going there. That's why that camera shot and panned back that way, because there was motion going on. And it doesn't pan away from there until it sees the other co-defendant, Devontae Rory, actually running through another section of the low-rise projects there. And he decides to cut through the southern portion of Bruce Court. And he's only in that video for a brief second. And then the video goes back, and motion detector goes back up to, it pans back up to more activity in that left corner. And that activity, upon closer observation, upon looking at all of the evidence and circumstances as to who was up there in that area, as the testimony from the officers on the scene, and some of the witnesses, there were only 2 people in that courtyard. 3 in totality, 1 officer on a bike on the street, and Freddie Gray and Officer Miller in that courtyard. Okay. Still shots actually show Officer Miller with his hands on what they call a bar, the handicap area of this particular railing, and it showed him lifting up his left leg in a downward motion, and it also shows Freddie Gray on his back with his hands up in the air like that. I'm going to show you this one shot here. You can see it. Okay, let me bring it a little closer to the right. I'll put my finger right there. That's the location where Freddie Gray was on his back, and that's the bar right across the top there that the officer was holding on. Okay, that's Bruce Court. Okay, I'll take away this picture. Give you another shot. My team and I, when we were out there, we decided to put cones down, yellow cones, and each cone signifies positioning of Freddie Gray's legs. The two bottom cones, let's go here, my finger. Okay, this cone here is Freddie Gray's left leg. This is his right leg. That's his right arm. Excuse me, and that's his left arm. Okay. This is taken from a still shot. So the picture of Freddie Gray laying there is in a still shot in those positions that I'm showing you right here. Okay. This is another still shot. Now we put yellow cones down so we can kind of give you detail as to what's going on here. Okay. You'll see these two cones here in the foreground, right? This one here. Okay. And we come back down to this one right there. Okay. That would have been the location of Officer Nero. Mind you, this is a sunny day. It was a sunny day on April 12th when this incident took place. So as you can see, I'm going to take you back over here now. Let me use my other hand. It's easier. Okay. This is that same area that I just showed you a few minutes ago with the yellow cones on the ground where Freddie's legs were. Okay. Now, do you see any obstructions from this cone or from this cone to this back area over here? Do you see any obstructions? When I say obstructions, I mean it's a clear view. So, as I started off the topic of this particular video, that Officer Nero was on his bike, 65, we marked it off, it's about 65 paces from where those small yellow cones were to these orange cones, where Officer Nero would have been able to see everything that was going on. Everything. Okay? I'm going to stop it right here. I'm going to pick it back up a little later and get to some other stuff. I appreciate your time. Thank you.